Today we will be examining subsistence-related food security issues with historical implications in Landless and State of Vermont recognized Abenaki tribes. Is survival and living the same thing? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, survival is the act or fact of living or continuing longer than another person or thing. Now imagine if the very nature of your survival relied on the acknowledgement and decisions made by individuals who forced their way into your culture or way of life. Throughout this presentation, we will address subsistence practices at large before relating this to food security issues at the local level, while also examining Native Abenaki's historical and continued struggles within the state of Vermont. This is a picture of Chief Don Stevens from the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe, which we'll talk about more later on. Connecting subsistence and food security. According to Native Alaskan Daisy Mae Barrera, subsistence can be interpreted and translated in many different ways, but to Native peoples it is a way to survive. Traditionally, Native communities relied solely on themselves to fulfill their subsistence practices, which included hunting, fishing, gathering, and more, and their strong beliefs surrounding the healing properties of spirituality, the environment, and the self are important. Food security, then, is defined as ready access to healthy or nutritious, culturally relevant, and favored foods of subsistence. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, food security means access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Oppositely, Native communities tend to view real food security obtained through subsistence practices as where people enjoy diets that are supportive not merely of their biophysical needs, but also of psychosocial and sociocultural health, is achieved not just through attention to supply, but also to stability, access, and relevance, and as such, can hardly be equated solely with food production or crop productivity. This well-established definition leaves little to the imagination as to their beliefs, while the USDA's vague definition guarantees to vary from person to person. Access to subsistence foods is necessary for all Native peoples' health and well-being globally, which is proven through the rise of medical conditions like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, since more westernized processed foods have become readily available. These stark differences are not only alarming, but a true depiction of the long-standing history between Native North Americans and westernized communities. Looking back, a historical perspective. This is a brief timeline overview of the history of indigenous peoples over the last 12,000 years on the land that has become known as Vermont. Originally, Vermont was considered a sort of no man's land, but certain archaeological revelations over the years have deemed otherwise. Anthropologists now believe that small bands of nomadic people named Paleo-Indians traveled throughout the land known as Vermont, engaging in subsistence practices of hunting and food gathering between approximately 12,000 and 9,500 years ago. Their main subsistence food supply included now extinct animals like caribou, mammoths, and mastodons from the still tundra-like environment, as well as seals, walruses, and whales found in the newly formed Champlain Sea. As the climate warmed, thus changing the geographic environment, a new era formed known as the Archaic period. Lasting from approximately 9,500 to 3,000 years ago, Native peoples had to actively adapt to their new environment, especially within their subsistence practices. Now, their whole lives revolved around the seasons, traveling based on climate. For example, Native bands traveled north for fishing through spring and summer, while relying on hunting in forested areas during the fall and winter to survive, all while continuing the necessary gathering of subsistence foods. During this period, the first signs of food storage over winter months was seen, indicating a less nomadic lifestyle. Next, the woodland period lasted approximately 3,000 to 300 or 400 years ago, still before the first arrival of European settlers. During this time, 5 language families, including Algonquian, Iroquoian, and Abenaki, were formed as the first officially known native tribes here. Little specific information is known about this time, but the understanding is that with the establishment of these different language families came further settlement and less traveling. The arrival of Samuel de Champlain and the first settlers is considered the beginning of the end of a way of life that had been lived for the past 11,000 years. By the time the first settlers arrived to this region, the 5 nations comprising of the Wabanaki Confederacy had been formed, including Abenaki, Malisite, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot. Differing greatly from the centuries before, this disastrous invasion prohibited Native peoples to find an active balance for adaptation. Instead, they suffered the loss of their land, persecution, ravages of introduced diseases with mortality rates of 80 to 90% in the epidemics of 1616 and 1633, and cultural undermining of their traditions and heritage, bringing Vermont Abenakis to the edge of extinction. Fast forward to the 1920s to find University of Vermont professor Harry Perkins-led eugenics survey. Over the course of about 30 years, at least 250 documented sterilizations occurred on Native peoples, impoverished individuals, and mentally and physically disabled individuals. This grave historical event continues to have lasting impacts to this day on Vermont natives. Not only were white colonists greedily trying to procure as much land as possible, the entire state of Vermont in this instance, but actively aspiring for complete erasure of the entire native population. This led most native individuals to become invisible to Euro-Americans between 16 to 1800 and all the way to present day. Facing forward, Abenaki tribes in Vermont today. What does landless tribe really mean? Well, it means quite literally what it says. Most of our native tribes no longer physically own any land. Being perceived as a landless tribe presents several issues for both native individuals themselves as well as Vermont communities by creating a continuous theme of invisibility for Abenaki individuals. Angelica Avanci of Vermont Public Radio shares the common Vermonters' mentality around our Abenaki peoples, saying, "It's as though they were ghosts and I had no way to see who they are. I mean, I may be rubbing shoulders with them every day and not know it." This very wording denotes the invisibility or less than attitude, as though our Abenaki communities are inhumane in comparison. The resounding Abenaki response to these sentiments is that the story is here, but it's been hidden. The Abenaki people who were basically written out of the story are still here. Likewise, these connotations associated with being essentially invisible impacts the psychosocial and sociocultural health of Native individuals, not to mention their image of self. According to Portman and Garrett, Native American healing traditions cannot be taken out of the context of their relationship to the four constructs of spirituality, community, environment, and self. By taking on this image of invisibility, our Native communities become imbalanced within those identified constraints, which instead require a critically delicate balance to ensure their health and well-being. Oppositely, in 2008, the Elnu tribe, Coasec tribe, Missisquoi tribe, and Nulhegan tribe of Abenaki formed the Vermont Indigenous Alliance with the purpose of unifying the tribes and pursuing official recognition from the state. Official state recognition is crucial for Native tribes to receive highly sought federal funds to support their children, elders, fund archaeologists in preservation efforts, and so much more. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, any tribes without state recognition were not eligible to receive the CARES Act funding, which would have provided a minimum of $100,000 in aid. It was not until 2011 that the Nulhegan Band of the Coasec Abenaki Nation and the Elnu tribe of the Abenaki were recognized by the state of Vermont, followed by the Coasec Traditional Band of Coas Abenaki Nation and the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi in 2012. Gaining state recognition has enabled these tribes to continue their mission of acknowledgement in the state of Vermont, vocalizing the needs for their known tribes and all other voiceless, landless tribes that reside here. Food security remains an ever-demanding and present issue within our Abenaki population in Vermont. According to Feeding America, 68,590 Vermonters are facing hunger, with 15,730 of those being children. Likewise, a University of Vermont study on the impact of COVID-19 stated that nearly 30% of Vermonters have experienced food insecurity, which is about triple the number of individuals affected in 2018. Unfortunately, due to the withstanding effects from the history of oppression against our Native population, many of our Indigenous Vermonters are not willing to self-identify as Abenaki. This creates very different kinds of hardships around gaining authentic statistics to better correlate and support the real issues of food security. In Tuck's open letter to communities about suspending damage, she continuously urges the consideration of long-term repercussions of thinking of ourselves as broken. Native perceptions of self are crucial for their overall well-being, and many still deny this existence within themselves out of fear. Desire is about longing, about a present that is enriched by both the past and the future. It is integral to our humanness, Tuck said. But our Abenaki are faced with fighting for a more promising, fulfilling future without the support of an enriched past. An ongoing issue in our Abenaki communities is the lack of access to quality, subsistent foods, that so many generations have not only survived but thrived on. As we previously discussed, our early native peoples naturally adapted as climate changes impacted their ability to hunt and gather the same types of subsistence foods necessary for their true survival. However, when these communities were literally sterilized and forced to either hide their own identities for survival or perish, they lost the only land that still belonged to them to survive off from. Without this, they have had nowhere to hunt, fish, gather, or cultivate their subsistence foods for decades. Luckily, the 4 recognized Abenaki tribes have diligently worked to reinvigorate their subsistence lifestyles the best that they can. Newly appointed in 2021, all Vermont Abenaki individuals associated with one of the 4 state-recognized bands are eligible to apply for free and permanent hunting and fishing licenses. Though this looks like a huge acknowledgement from the state, Nulhegan Band Chief Don Stevens loudly argues that their ancestors never gave up those hunting and fishing rights, but rather the state of Vermont didn't honor them. This supposed permanent license must still be renewed every year with proof of a valid tribal identification card, and certain animals like moose are not included. Abenaki hunters argue that these strict guidelines rule out several traditional subsistence foods that other states do not limit as readily. For example, in Maine, indigenous people can go on subsistence hunts and are given tags to hunt for all kinds of wild game, from muskrat to duck to moose, from mid-September through December. Both the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi and Nulhegan Abenaki tribes host fairly thriving food programs which support not only their tribes but their overall local community to raise awareness of traditional subsistence foods. The included picture shows Lucy Neal, creator of the Holland Food Shelf for the Nulhegan Band, which is housed in the shuttered elementary school she used to work in. They estimate serving 150 to 175 individuals monthly at this one location, but staffing shortages only allow them to open a few times per month. I had the privilege of interviewing Earl Hatley, Grand Riverkeeper for the LEAD agency, which stands for Leading the Way to Environmental Justice. He transplanted himself from Oklahoma to Quechee, Vermont to help lead assistive subsistence efforts with the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi. He passionately described the importance of food forests and the 3 sisters concepts of farming that were traditionally used by native peoples widespread across the United States. Food forests, not to be confused with simply vegetable gardens, are ancient agricultural concepts that are largely self-maintaining, whole and inclusive, interdependent, and highly productive systems of multi-storied trees, shrubs, grasses, flowers, pollinators, soil, water, and inhabitants. Hatley explained how this unique ecosystem not only coexisted together in synchronicity, which he described as a unexplainable spiritual connectivity, but it also drew hunted animals to the tribe versus necessitating a widespread hunt. This intelligent concept is so foreign to Euro-Americans who clearly did not know how to properly cultivate the land. Similarly, Hatley addressed the traditional growing method of the 3 sisters, which consists of beans, corn, and squash, and creates a biodiverse system. This version of companion planting hones in on the symbiotic relationship between these 3 largely native crops, allowing them to thrive. Both of Hatley's points answers the questions of why he moved here. He is actively working with town officials to begin a traditional Abenaki garden in Quechee, Vermont in April 2022, and will also help officiate a food forest in Clifford Park in West Hartford, Vermont next spring. The literal fruits of his labor will be sent mostly to the Missisquoi tribe, but also to the handful of local unnamed bands in Thetford and Stratford, Vermont. Lee describes the importance of collective decisions within Native communities, including subsistence, by sharing with not only the nuclear family but also the extended family and for others of the community in need, helping them to fulfill cultural values versus non-natives who fixate on only personal decisions instead. This is truly evident by Hatley's dedication to the Missisquoi tribe, who mainly reside about 100 miles north of Hartford, Vermont. So where do we go from here? Subsistence equals survival. For Native communities, subsistence practices are considered a more profound symbol system of identity even than language. By forcing our Abenaki populations from their land and thus traditional foods found through subsistence practices, they continue to show lower overall quality of life for individuals suffering from disease, impacting families and communities in which these individuals live. Beyond the physical implications, the long-lasting psychological impact from years of drastic elimination strategies continues to threaten our Abenaki population in Vermont today. Though the small steps already taken are a good start, they are only just that. There is still a very long road ahead to allow for healing and true fulfillment of self. And these are my references cited.